Oh, good morning. Morning. It's a great pleasure celebrating the 50 years of democratic revolution in Portugal with all of you. And I'd like to thank the Center for European Studies for hosting this event in collaboration with the Consulate General of Portugal and the Camões Institute. The democratic transition in Portugal, the April 25th revolution, always generated great interest among scholars of studying the transitions to democracy. Not only because of the unique internal dynamics of the political events that took place between 1974 and 1976, but also because of the international context in which it progressed. The Watergate and the end of the Nixon administration in August 1974, the relative distrust of the newly inaugurated Ford administration in relation to the events unfolding in Portugal, in particularly in 1975, even the economic consequences of the Yom Kippur War, the détente in the Cold War, and the negotiation leading to the signing of the Helsinki Final Act, and of course the process of democratization that spread to Southern Europe, to Latin America, and then to Eastern Europe. So all that international context influenced the revolution, the dynamics of the revolution in Portugal, and in turn the events in Portugal also influenced events in other countries, such as the transition to democracy in Spain. So, and most of all, I think they had a huge transformative, positive impact in Portugal that the Portuguese are celebrating today all over the world. So, assessing the internal and international impact of 50 years of democracy in Portugal in such an environment of academic freedom and excellence as Harvard is a great privilege to all of us, and I'll look forward to learning more about your assessment of what we've been able to achieve in these 50 years from all of you. Thank you.
So thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, General Consul Araujo. It's really great to coordinate this event with you, and also want to thank the Instituto Camões who helped with this. And so welcome, everybody. I'm Daniel Ziblatt. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies, and we all know why we're here, to celebrate and remember this important day, April 25th, 1974, when a group of young junior officers in the Portuguese armed forces led a military coup that overthrew Europe's most long-standing dictatorship and launched a process of democratization. It wasn't always an easy process, certainly not an automatic process. I mean, there was coup attempts after 1974, many governments after 1974, but by 1976, a democratic government was established. That's a remarkable achievement, and so it's worth noting that today. So we have an excellent panel here today gathered. I just want to make two brief remarks before introducing the panel. I think there's two, as a scholar of democracy, American democracy, European democracy, when I think about this date and the events that have happened since the 50 years since then, really two, kind of to put this in context, 2 points I would like to make. First, that, as we just heard, this was the kind of trigger point of a process that made the world much more democratic. So between 1974 and 1990, this is before the collapse of communism, 1990, 30 new democracies appeared on Earth. So this sparked a wave of democratization that the scholar Samuel Huntington has called the third wave of democracy. And this began in Portugal. So this was, these events made the world more democratic. So that's one point. A second point I would make is that, we live today, though, of course, in the era in which authoritarianism seems to be on the march. There's authoritarian threats everywhere, right-wing movements in Portugal as well, which I hope is something we can discuss today. But in that context, it's really important and inspiring to remember, as I've read histories of these days and these years around 1974, that citizens can beat back authoritarianism, that they can take control of their own government. And so this is something that's an inspiring lesson, I think, for all of us in the United States and everywhere. Democracy is, of course, long, grinding work. It's never easy. So today, I think we can talk about both achievements as well as challenges. So I hope that's sort of the content of what we're going to be talking about today. So a couple of words on our panel. We have an excellent panel gathered together. Our first speaker will be Antonio Costa Pinto. I was just remembering that the last time we saw each other was in the building where all of this began in Lisbon. So it's great to have you here today. Antonio is a visiting fellow at the Weatherhead Center. He's a research professor at University of Lisbon. He's been visiting professor at many of the world's great universities, holds a PhD from the EUI in Florence. He's the author of many important books, including a couple of books on interwar fascism, which I know have influenced my own work, I can say. Most recently, he's editor of the very important Oxford Handbook of Portuguese Politics, and author of Political Institutions and Democracy in Portugal. He's often a commentator on Portuguese politics. So his comments today will focus primarily on the politics. We have sort of a division of labor between our three panelists. Our second speaker will be remarking the economic evolution of Portugal. Lucio Venhas de Souza, who's an advisor to the leadership of the EU's Joint Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense in Brussels, and a board member of the National Economic Club in Washington, D.C. And he's currently a fellow here at Harvard and a visiting professor at Brandeis. He holds a PhD in economics from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and is the author of more than 100 publications on monetary policy. And so he's been here this year working on a book called The Century of Global Economic Crises, Monetary Policy in Search of an Anchor. I guess it's forthcoming very soon, so look forward to that. And then our third speaker will be commenting on the social developments within Portugal since 1974 is Daniela Mello, who's a lecturer in social sciences at Boston University. She holds a PhD in political science from University of Connecticut and has published extensively on Portuguese politics in the wake of the Carnation Revolution. Has a recent book, I think, on Captain's Coup, Portugal after the Carnation Revolution. Yeah, I think I saw a cover of it online. Daniela served as a consultant for the U.S. State Department, is the founder, I didn't know about this, of the New Bedford Light, a nonprofit, nonpartisan local news outlet. So that's important for democracy as well, I can say, yeah. So really great to have all of these speakers here. So the run of the show basically is each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. I'll keep track of the time, and then we'll open it up for conversation between us and with the audience. So again, welcome, and it's great to be here. So the floor is yours, Antonio.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation. I would like, of course, to, first of all, to give, in a way, my regards to the director of the Center for European Studies, Daniel Ziblatt, that I don't know, for a couple of years. And we met, as a matter of fact, last year at the Carmo barrack, where everything, in a way, began. From where Marcelo Caetano, the last prime minister after the dictatorship, left in a tank to the airport, then to Madeira, and then to exile, as a matter of fact, in Brazil. Thanks also to the Portuguese Council and the organizers of this conference. I have a PowerPoint, so... Oh, it's there. Okay, I'm sorry. Now, let me start to say that the Portuguese transition to democracy caught the international community and also the academic milieu by surprise. And one of the curious, I think, in strict academic terms, when the curious dimension of the research on the Portuguese transition to democracy is that the first experts on the Portuguese Revolution came from the US, and they were mainly Brazilianists. Philip Schmitter, a well-known US political scientist teaching at the European University and then at Stanford, etc., came immediately to Portugal and wrote the first academic article, in a way, on the Portuguese transition. And transition was not there. The title of the article was Liberation by Coup. The point I want to make is that, in a way, the integration of the Portuguese 25 de Abril in the wave, the so-called third wave of democratization, that in a way celebrated in the first paragraph of Samuel Huntington's book on the third wave, started with the Quartel do Carmo and 25 de Abril, in a way is a sort of a posteriori reconstruction and integration of the Portuguese case within the global third wave of democratization. As you know, democratization in Southern Europe was, in the way, the three processes of democratization in Southern Europe were almost simultaneous. Portugal in 1974, Greece in 1975, and Spain. There is no date, in a way. You know, in processes of transition to democracy by, let us say, pacted transitions sometimes do not have a date. We could consider it, you know, the Spanish Constitution of 1977 as the founding, let us say, founding element of when Spain became a full-fledged democracy. So the majority of the cases of the so-called third wave, they come later, with the end of the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, etc. So the point I would like to make is the following. Why do I like this cartoon? Mm-hmm. Because here we have major thinkers of the 20th century looking at small Portugal. So we have Marx, we have Lenin, we have Mao, we have Trotsky, we have Sartre, who visited Portugal in 1975, and many others. So why they are there, in a way? Because there are things that need to be explained in the Portuguese case. We must admit that, for instance, in the Spanish transition to democracy, there was many challenges, of course, but the authoritarian elite knew that they were on the processes of debate, discussion, and tensions between authoritarian elites and pro-democratic elites. So, in a way, there are lots of things to be explained, but that's it. It's a process of transition to democracy. In a way, in the case of Brazil, it's the same. When the military decided started to negotiate with democratic elites, civilian democratic elites, a process of transition from a military dictatorship to a democracy, that's it. We need to explain, but that's it. So, but in the Portuguese case, no. And that's the point I would like to make, because we have a transition to democracy, yes, but above all, we have a democratic revolution. We have a pre-revolutionary juncture. We have political actors that are not exactly common in processes of transition to democracy, and of course, the military. So at the same time, the reason why I have this cartoon here is that, for instance, Maoists, there is Mao Zedong there. Maoism is, of course, it was a central, let us say, ideological and even political movement in the second half of especially the 1960s of the 20th century. But okay, do Maoists play an important role in Europe in process of political change? No, of course they play important roles, not exactly very, on the democratic perspective, not a very interesting one, but of course in Latin America, in Asia, etc. But in the case of Portugal, all these elements are basically present. So let me go straight to the point, to the first point. The Portuguese new state was, in a way, overthrown, and we know exactly how and why it was overthrown. the military nature of the Portuguese transition to democracy, the non-hierarchical military coup of 1975, is strictly related with the colonial war. I cannot develop the topic, but I think it's very interesting for two reasons. First, authoritarian regimes, the role of identity and ideology in authoritarian regimes, it's much stronger than we can think, compare with democracy. And that was exactly the case of Portugal in the 1960s. As we might see with the data that our colleague is going to present you, in the late 60s, Portugal was, as Spain, a part of the European economic boom, with the huge process of economic growth. The Portuguese economy became much more linked to Europe. To be brief, Portugal, in strict economic terms, did not need their colonies. The basic, and I think this is interesting, the basic element here is in a way how a unified political elite of a dictatorship thinks and rethinks that Portugal cannot survive without their colonies. And that's why for 14 years, and in some cases against the international community, not just even the allies of Portugal were very reluctant from 1970 on to give military support and economic support to the Portuguese colonial war, the European partners, and even the US government to the Portuguese colonial war. So in a way, the military, non-hierarchical military coup of 1974 is strictly related with the colonial war. We must stop the colonial war. And the Portuguese Vietnam, curiously, was not in Vietnam, but in the, nowadays, let us say, a very curious state is Guinea-Bissau, where Portugal lost the colonial war in strict military terms. And that's on the very base of the Portuguese transition to democracy. So we have a non-hierarchical military coup, but then, and that's the most interesting and important element, we have a simultaneous process of democratization and decolonization. Very unusual. We know how, for instance, the dynamics of decolonization of Algeria. We know the effects of this process in the French political system. But in the case of Portugal, we have, after 1974, this simultaneous process of democratization and decolonization. And the main reason that explains why the military decided to stay, the armed forces movement decided to stay in Portuguese politics, was related with conflicts within the military institution in terms of what kind of decolonization we're going to do. And in the end, in a year, Portugal is going to decolonize basically through a process of transfer of power to the liberation movements of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. Of course, in the case of Angola, there were three. It became much more complicated. The fourth element I would like to stress is that the Portuguese transition to democracy has characteristics that we do not find in other geographies since the Second World War. What I mean by that is that the symbolic and political break with the past has many elements that were basically elements from the second wave of democratization after 1945. What I mean by that is that we have political purges. We have the exile of segments of the Portuguese political elite. We have the dissolution of the authoritarian institutions, also has a social movement. And what I mean by that is that the dissolution of the single party, of the official newspaper of the single party, of censorship, it's not just a product of laws produced by a democratic political regime, but also by occupation, by the presence, as a matter of fact, of society and social movements in the dissolution of this kind of institutions. And the Portuguese transition to democracy has also another characteristic that in a way is very much blended with the cultural atmosphere of the left of the 1960s, of the global left of the 1960s, has movements to defascistize the minds, with dynamics like students going to the countryside to explain what democracy is to the Portuguese rural society in 1974, 75. So, of course, there is a crisis of the state. We have radicalization of social movements, and another curious dimension, much more connected with the global 1960s, we have an anti-capitalist wave that it's not related with the process of building of a Soviet type of authoritarian regime, but a strong association of anti-capitalism with the nature of the Portuguese dictatorships. Okay, to conclude. So, to conclude very briefly, since I have 2 minutes. So, what is, and I will conclude with this dimension. So, what we have in the Portuguese transition to democracy as well is a huge contradiction between the dynamics of the social movements and the first democratic elections. The first democratic elections are the founding moment of the consolidation of Portuguese democracy and a tension between the radicalization of social movements and the electoral legitimacy, because who is going to win the Portuguese elections are the moderate political parties, not the parties of the radical left. These parties, of course, are very much supported by the international community, the Western international community, because in 1975, the Western perception of the Portuguese Revolution is there is a sort of a communist takeover of power in Portugal, what is not going to be the case. So, to conclude, Portuguese democracy, in a way, it's also the product of what Kenneth Maxwell calls, an analyst of the Portuguese transition, taming the revolution. It was a process of overcoming the legacies of right-wing dictatorship, but also the legacies of the radicalization of social movements and even the anti-capitalist wave of 1974-75. And that's where, in a way, the Portuguese democracy is as the product of a double legacy, a right-wing legacy and a left-wing legacy. That's it. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you. Many thanks again for the organization of this wonderful event. Thanks to Danielle, thanks to Elaine, who is there, the Deputy Director of the Center. Much appreciated all the efforts. And Thiago here in front of us, our consul here in Boston. Now, Antonio told you a story of a rupture, namely an institutional democratic rupture. What I'm going to tell you is actually a story about continuity. I don't have to tell you that Portugal is a relatively small country. It's remarkable how much we managed to do historically, given how small we are as a people, and the fact that we live in a strategically indefensible part of the Iberian Peninsula. We survived as a nation due to a series of strategic miracles, as a matter of fact. Now, the point about Portugal is that we are, in a way, the classical small open economy, right? So I don't know how many economists we have here on the room. I think that we have at least two on the bench itself. But that means that we are very much influenced by our economic relations with the rest of the planet. Just in terms of import and exports, is over 100% of the Portuguese GDP. Small open economy, right? So the implication of what I'm going to tell you is that we have had a particular type of integration process which actually precedes the revolution itself. The revolution is a rupture in terms of democratic institutions, but not actually in terms of the integration process of the Portuguese economy. Just a little background. We don't have to be reminded here that we had over 48 years dictatorship in Portugal, the so-called Estado Novo, which was a both nationalist, corporativist, and autocratic type of regime. At the same time, a peculiar feature of this regime is that already on the second half of the 1950s, they had started a process of economic integration, which preceded the colonial wars, as a matter of fact. The country was a founding member of NATO, I should point out, is a founding member of the OECD. We actually received help from the Marshall Plan, even if we were neutral during Second World War, as a matter of fact, right? And we already had signed a free trade association with the European Economic Community in 1972. It was complicated due to our association with EFTA, which was a British-dominated free trade organization. But the implication of this is that we are talking about a process of economic integration with real significant gains in terms of welfare and GDP per capita of Portugal that actually precedes the revolution and will continue afterwards, right? It's also important for us to remember that this was a process of economic integration which was actually supported by the constitution of quite large and economically sophisticated and diversified private economic groups in Portugal. It's perhaps a question of memory for some of us, but if you go back 50 years, we had some of the largest private industries on the Iberian Peninsula. Some of the Portuguese companies in those days were actually among the largest among the European companies, as a matter of fact. The old CUF, Companhia União Fabril, there was a point in time in which the turnover was 75% of the whole GDP of Portugal. So a seriously large diversified company, almost like Zaibatsu, the type of a conglomerate that you have in Korea. You're going to understand why I'm making this sort of a comparisons in a moment. So the implication of that is that we had a process of economic development which is, in a way, long-term and linked to this internal dynamics, which is not only from an economic, but from a human point of view. Daniela will mention later that when we were looking at in terms of human flows, so migration, we had actually decided to go to Europe before we became members of the European Union. The flows of migrants that we had already from the 60s onward are not to Africa, not to the overseas provinces, are actually to other European countries themselves. So we as a people also decided to vote for Europe, for this type of integration, even before we decided that we, as a polis, were going to become members of the European Union. The interesting thing from the point of view of economic integration is the dynamics of the process and what happens on this period pre- and post-European Union accession. We're going to see in a moment, right, that what happens is that we had a process of economic development, both at the level of aggregate GDP per capita and what we as individual Portuguese, so GDP per capita growth, actually goes significantly down after the process of European Union integration, which is a very counterintuitive type of outcome. If you think in terms of the type of supports that we were going to receive from the point of view of the European Union. Just to put this in perspective, our GDP per capita in Portugal, it roughly increases by 140% since we became members of the European Union. This is a period of half a century. On the 20 years before, our GDP per capita had increased by over 270%. So the relative growth dynamics between those two periods is particularly noticeable due to their differences. And the slowdown is actually concentrated in the past 20 years. You can actually observe this here. So that is beginning of the 1950s. Carnation Revolution is around here. That's the moment that we enter the European Union. You don't see a break. It's a continuous trend, right? So you have roughly a similar type of growth rate. Comes here around 99, 2000, something happens, right? So the convergence process breaks down, as a matter of fact. So instead of rupture, the story that I'm telling you is actually one of continuity in which this process of integration with the particular European spaces antecedes the process of revolutionary change, of democratic institutions. From an analytical point of view, what I think is important for us to understand from the point of view of going forward, thinking about the future of Portugal as a nation, is the reason of the break that we observe around the 99 and 2000. What I'm showing to you is a robust conclusion, regardless of the type of benchmark that you use. We can think of this in terms of the traditional European Union type of a benchmark, which is convergence, us in relation to the European Union average. The process also broke down. We effectively, in terms of our relation, in terms of the European Union average, we are below the level that we had in 1973. One of the reasons for that is because we roughly stagnated in the past 20 years. But the other guys, they keep on growing, right? So the difference in relation to the average, especially since 1999, effectively has increased. Okay, why? We should remember that our process of integration is something that was accompanied by a significant amount of support from the side of the European Union, not only in terms of free access to markets. We can sell to the large, sophisticated European markets essentially cost-free. It's a common market in the end of the day, right? We are members of the euro area. That means that you are taken out of the process of economic exchanges the veil of the exchange rate. That should all increase integration, make easier for us as an economy to integrate in the broad spaces of the European Union. Not to mention the small detail of the significant amount of unilateral financial transfers that the European Union keep on sending to us. Roughly 1.8%, 1.7, 1.8 of the European GDP on a yearly basis for the past 30 years. And I'm not counting the RRP, the Recovery and Resilience Plan, with which I have to confess I was laterally involved on the design of the RRP for Portugal. Now, why? Right? I'm not even counting all sorts of other lateral supporters that we receive, the subsidized loans from the IB, the money from the European institutions during the Troika period. Why? Let me ask you, how many economists do we have here on the room? Raise your hand. Wow, okay, true, okay. What I'm going to do now is what's called a growth decomposition exercise, right? We have this big conundrum. I mean, the country had so much going for it. Why did this happen, right? So I will do this by what's called a growth decomposition, which is essentially a Cobb-Douglas production function, labor and capital. Daniela will talk about labor later. I'm talking about capital here, plus the solo residual, so total factor productivity, technological shock, right? I do this. We have wonderful long-term series in Portugal, thanks to the Banco de Portugal and to the INE. I can do this sort of exercise, and I get to this. The remarkable thing is that after European Union accession, the contribution of human capital, both in terms of quantity and quality, improves. We are the most educated generation in the history of the country. It would be strange if this were not the case. But the contribution of investment and the contribution of total factor productivity, so technology, capital goes down by a third. We don't invest anymore. And the contribution of technology for growth in Portugal becomes negative. Right? Is from the point of view of economic theory, that is an extremely unusual type of result. The question then becomes, why? You understand why I mentioned the ecosystem of companies in Portugal because of that. The structure of economic units in Portugal, the ecosystem of companies, is constituted of 96% that are micro companies. So of every 100 companies in Portugal, 96 are micro companies. The equivalent share in the United States is 16%. The number of large companies in Portugal, and we have a particular definition of large, which is related to the size of the country, is 0.1% of our companies. In the United States, is 14 times more. The implication of that is that we had a process which essentially distorted the economic structure of the country towards domination by micro companies, not even small, micro companies, which are concentrated on primary, traditional sectors that do not invest. Real estate, we all would like to have a house in Portugal, I know that, but I mean, from the point of view of long-term growth dynamics, and things like restaurants, etc. Traditional sectors that do not invest. The implication of that is that the total amount of investment in the country collapsed. Take a look at this. This is the period that is in the run-up to 74, the initial integration of the country. By the beginning of the 70s, we had Chinese levels of investment in the country, over 30% of GDP. Right? Then you have a period that goes roughly until 99, in which lower but stable, and then it collapses after 99. Nowadays, and this is private investment, this is state investment, the amount of state investment that we had doesn't even cover for obsolescence. That means that our stock of public capital in Portugal is actually going down because we don't pay for the usage, right? So the implication of this is the following. You have a typical structure in which there are disincentives to accumulation of capital. There are disincentives for you to invest in more sophisticated types of activities, at the same time in which the size of the Portuguese government increased very significantly. In terms of taxation in relation to GDP, we are over 2.5 times what we had back in the beginning of the 70s, right? And the composition of expenditures, this obviously reflects societal needs in Portugal, the fact that we have the type of education structure that we have nowadays, the fact that we have social security, unemployment benefits, right? All necessary and laudable things, but implies that in terms of our structure, we essentially don't invest anymore, and we use the money that we have to keep a big social state. The results of that are obvious in terms of long-term growth. There is one thing in which we do beat the European Union average. We tax more our companies than we regulate them more. Right? So just take a look here. Right? So now, when you think about that, then the outcome is the following. Recap of my continuity with a different type of structural break story, contrary to the break story that Antonio told us, is the following. We were growing before the revolution, after the revolution, have enormous gains in terms of average welfare per capita in the Portuguese population. We live longer than the Americans nowadays. The level of infant mortality in Portugal actually is lower than in the United States. Obviously, it's a statement about also the United States, right? Beyond Portugal, right? But it shows you the amount of gains that we had in the country. They're truly remarkable. But something happened at some point around 20, 25 years ago, and we roughly stagnated. Why? We capitalized partially in terms of all the possibilities related to democracy, all the possibilities related to European Union accession, but imperfectly. Right? What this tells us about the future? Shrinking population, less Portuguese than before. Population in Portugal has been shrinking for 10 years straight now. We are below replacement rate. We have government policies which effectively curb private investment and investment sophisticated types of sectors which are important for the country's future. If we not correct that, we clearly have problems in the future. Our political transition is an example for the rest of the world. It's a remarkable moment in our history of which we all should be proud of, but we have to think about the future too. European Union membership is not a silver bullet to solve that if you have domestic policies which are effectively dysfunctional from the point of view of the long-term growth of the country. And we should all remember one thing. We may be living out of external transfers for a long period of our history. One day, they will end. Should all remember that. With this said, thanks for your attention. Viu 25 de Abril, and thanks for your attention.
So this is to move forward.
There you go. You just move that forward, that moves it backward.
Perfect, perfect. Well, it's not an easy task to follow these two speakers who, I mean, I have so many questions already connecting, particularly to Lucia's questions, but also to Antonio's. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak to this audience. And I will talk about some of the social dimensions of the change that happened. And I actually decided to call it a social earthquake, because the more I think about it, the more radical the difference looks to me. And I wanted to bring a bit of that conversation to us, because one thing is to see numbers, another thing is to really live through it and to have a memory of it. Now, I was born after the revolution. I was born in 1981, so I'm definitely in that first generation, right, born into the 1980s. But I'm going to do today something that I don't normally do in my presentations, which is personalize it. And I'll personalize it because I think my own trajectory and the trajectory of my family is a trajectory of Portugal. in the past 50 years. And why do I say that? I grew up in northern Portugal in a city that is urban-rural. In the 1960s, you know what I mean, right? It's a city. It has a lot of factories, but it's also very rural. It's kind of a unique combination. And in the 1960s, we had the textile industry arrive, and then the shoe industry arrive, particularly with EFTA, right, with the opening of the economy. So my family is a family that was a farming family on both sides of the family. On one side, they owned land. On the other side, they were basically peasants, working in a very feudal type of system in which, you paid for your labor with your production, right? Out of 4 grandparents, 3 were illiterate. 3 grandparents illiterate. Both my parents, who were 17 and 14 in 1974 when the revolution hit, had only a basic level of education. And my mom, who was a seamstress, became a full-time laborer as a seamstress at the age of 11, and my father was working in a factory by the age of 13. Right? So why do I say this? This presentation is not about me, I promise. It is about Portugal. Is that the future I had, the access to education I had, the qualitative jump, the social elevator that came for people with my background in Portugal was truly revolutionary. It was an incredible transformation, and that's why I'm calling it an earthquake, right? Because up to me, and I'm the oldest of the grandchildren on my side, nobody had even gone to high school in my entire family for as long as anyone can remember. So I felt that impact. I saw that I lived through the transition of Portugal in the 1980s. I grew up in this multi-generational household with a grandmother who wore a headscarf, no shoes except for church and to go to the doctor, and always walked around with a sickle, right? Because she needed to cut fresh grass wherever she went for all her animals at the end of the day. So I feel like I'm the transition. I represent that group of people that saw the before and the after and who benefited tremendously through the after. So I also chose Sérgio Godinho as sort of the theme for my presentation here. What you see here is a picture from a village in northern Portugal in 1982, right? And the line there is from a very well-known song by Sérgio Godinho, and it reads, "Peace, bread, housing, health, and education," right? And my presentation is mostly about these themes and the transformational again, earthquake that came in terms of this with the before and the after of the revolution. It was obviously not immediate, right? You don't, just because you have a revolution and suddenly you have a democracy, you're not going to fix huge inequality. You're not going to fix illiteracy overnight. This was obviously a very long process. But the beginning of that process, the democratization of access to health and to education were incredible, right? And that was fairly sudden. So I actually want to show you a short clip, worthwhile. It is about children, child labor.
1992 foi o ano da reforma educativa. Guilherme acabou o ciclo em junho. Este ano devia ingressar no 7º dos 9 anos de escolaridade obrigatória.
Não gosto de poder, mas não deixava mais ir.
Quanto é que tu ganhas?
São 1000 paus por dia, é com os quantos dias que eu trabalhar.
Dás dinheiro aos teus pais ou não?
Dou todo.
Na construção sempre é mais fácil fugir aos fiscais e Guilherme vai permanecer por aqui até fazer 15 anos. Com a idade mínima para trabalhar, pode então passar para uma fábrica e aprender o ofício de marceneiro. Na secundária de Felgueiras, 17 dos 350 inscritos no 7º ano não chegaram a pôr os pés na escola. O abandono é especialmente sentido nas freguesias rurais. Sónia tem 10 anos, frequenta a 4ª classe e o ciclo ainda está no seu horizonte.
Mas ela não continua.
Porquê?
Porque as postas não chegam.
Sónia vai ajudar a mãe até ter idade para pedir trabalho à porta de uma das muitas fábricas de calçado do concelho. O trabalho feito em casa e paga à peça é costume da maioria das famílias. Cada saco de 10 sapatos rende 500 escudos e todas as mãos são poucas. Depois da escola e dos deveres, Susana ajuda uma vizinha a fazer a obra. O despacho com que dá ao ponto é bem prova do treino.
Já ganhei mate-borronas de 390. Muitas vezes ganho 500, outras vezes outros 500.
Por cada dia?
Cada dia não. Ao vez ao mês.
Também na família Lobo, as noites são à volta da fogueira, de agulha e cabedal na mão. Cheira a lenha e pão fresco neste canto de velhos tempos.
É dos bois.
São 13 filhos e 7 ainda em casa. Vivem da lavoura, da reforma do pai, mais da pensão que a Segurança Social atribui a Serafim. O que é que tu gostavas de ser quando fosses grande?
Ir para a fábrica.
Carlos tinha outras ambições, mas ficou-se pela 4ª classe. Não quiseste seguir?
O pai não deixou, tínhamos pouca gente, temos muito trabalho para fazer.
Tu gostavas de ter seguido?
Gostava. Não era uma vida muito má.
O que é que gostavas de ser quando fosses grande?
Ser patrão.
Esta noite, mais um saco de sapatos aviado. Para o empresário que os distribui, uma encomenda barata, despida de imposto ou encargos sociais. E há sempre mãos estendidas a oferecer mais e mais trabalho. O trabalho infantil também se escreve a negro. Pedro foi dos que pagou caro a sua inexperiência. Tinha apenas 12 anos quando perdeu os dedos de uma mão, numa máquina de padaria.
Só trabalha quem precisa. Sorte daqueles que nascem ricos. Quem precisa tem que trabalhar. Não acho nada, acho que havia de haver mais direitos.
Thank you. If you could. So, again, if you don't understand Portuguese, I apologize, but I think the imagery itself is pretty powerful. Believe it or not, that was my hometown. So I didn't intend to show that clip, but when I started looking at it, child labor clips from the 1990s, heavily focused on my region and my hometown. And that again told a story that was very familiar to me growing up. I too had a friend who at age 8 lost all the fingers in his hand, well, 4 fingers in one hand, operating this presser in a shoe factory, right? And of the 35 kids who went to elementary school with me, as far as I know, only 2 of us ever made it to university. So I don't want to overemphasize, the transformation. It wasn't immediate, though. This is an important thing. And poverty was rampant. But child labor was something that was completely rampant in Portugal up to this point. And I tried to look at the official statistics from the census in 60s and 70s, which put child labor in Portugal at under 200,000. I think that's a grossly underestimate because every child was working in farms. And then when the factories came, they were working in the factories, right? The kids in my elementary school in the 1980s, we had school until 1 p.m. At 1:30, they were working in the factory with their parents until later. So it's a story in which all of these different factors sort of come together, right? There's a story about the illiteracy of the parents. It's a story about the poverty of the parents and the dire need to have an extra salary in that family by any means that it can come to you. And it's a story of a country that is changing very rapidly, but can't quite accommodate all of those individuals immediately. So the clip you saw was from the 1990s. You can still see the poverty. I mean, some of the other numbers are incredible. By the time of the revolution, something like 68% of houses in Portugal had no shower, no bathtub. 53% had no running water. Those things were fixable faster than the education and the illiteracy, but it gives you a sense of how the majority of the Portuguese were actually living day to day. Look at these numbers. They might be familiar to most of you. That's another song by Sergio Godinho that I'm a particular fan of. You can see that basically 1 in 4 Portuguese were completely illiterate. But if you look at women versus men, you see that the rate of illiteracy is actually much higher. And again, it's again my own view from coming from up north where illiteracy was perhaps far more rampant. I think these numbers are skewed. If you look at certain regions, in certain regions, illiteracy was far more rampant, right? I didn't know anyone. Well, I can count in one hand the people I knew of my grandparents' age who actually knew how to read and write, right? Of course, the democratization of access to school is everything. So access to school was already there up to 4th grade, but immediately there was a number of laws that were passed, to make schooling mandatory. I remember that people in 1980 who were just 1 year older than I was only had to go to 6th grade, and their parents were plucking them right off from 6th grade and putting them in the factories, often to help contribute to build a new home or to have a better life in the household. And for me, it was 9th grade, and then so it was done in a staggered way, so it wasn't immediate, and that was kind of interesting. But you can see sort of the incredible results of that. So on top, you have 1974. At the bottom, you have 2022. You have the distribution by age from preschool to elementary school to then what we call middle school and high school, right? And you can see that nowadays, right, this is a victory that this is a gap we have closed. Access to university, right? Another great equalizer. Of course, it's an equalizer that then sees my generation arrive at a period of economic stagnation, right? Because we have the contrast of having invested so heavily on education. We suddenly have the most well-prepared, most well-educated, specialized generation that Portugal has ever produced, and that's an incredible achievement in and of itself, but we don't have an economy that can actually accommodate that growth, right? And so it generates all sorts of new grievances, which I'm sure we'll discuss soon enough, right? I must be running out of time, so I just want to check.
2 minutes.
Okay, excellent. The other great achievement, of course, is access to healthcare. Right? Access to healthcare it goes hand in hand with quality of life, with diminishing poverty, with all sorts of other improvements in the quality of life of the Portuguese. This one is another one that, again, from personal experience is dear to my heart. So I told you about my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother had 9 children. 2 of which died as children, thus contributing to that 38% mortality rate, which is incredible. Think what that meant in real terms, right? A 38% mortality rate within the first year of life. People didn't have access to doctors. There weren't enough doctors, there weren't enough hospitals. They cost money. They didn't have access to medical care. These children were born largely at home, right? The mothers themselves didn't have much access to postpartum care. Again, my grandmother had 9 children, all born at home, 2 completely by herself, okay? Not an unusual story, right? And we didn't live in a faraway rural area. It's a heavy, populated area. So this is incredible, right? This rate, as Lucy pointed out, right, we're basically on par with all developed nations, doing even better than some. The number of doctors, I thought I would show this here, steadily increased. Of course, access to education, access to subsidized education, in particular, the boom of the largest share of people with access to university, all of that has contributed, and that's, of course, a big part of the story of, having an NHS helps, right? Again, I'm not pretending that there are no problems with our NHS at the time, but I'll leave that for discussion as well. And the last thing that I want to talk about just very briefly, because I'm running out of time, and I think the economists in the room can speak much better than I can to this particular point, is that Portuguese economy changed very quickly, right? So we went from having a huge agricultural sector, right, to having a huge service sector. And this has had a number of, again, it has had a huge impact because as I see Portugal, I mean, we can unpack this a little bit more and in more detail during Q&A, but you know, Portugal is going through these major social transformations, almost social shocks, I would call them, right? But you still have all of these generations cohabitating, right? And different value systems cohabitating and sometimes clashing with each other. And the transformation of the economy has also left a lot of people behind from my generation that didn't have access to education. So those who were plucked from the school to go to the factories because suddenly there was a lot of factory work in the 1980s and the 1990s and the salaries were better, and going to the factory, like the little boy in the video was saying, you know, or it was the girl, I think, is great. Like, that's the ambition. Going to the factory will mean a better life than the countryside. Well, the factories are disappearing now. Where are those voters going? Where are those workers going right now? So there's a huge sense of dread about this change in the economy, which I would argue is also feeding some of the political earthquakes that we've been having in Portugal as well. So I'm going to stop here, but thank you for your attention and for taking my personal take on this as well. And I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you all for really fascinating presentations. And we sort of, we've gotten a political, an economic, and a social perspective, which I think really nicely complement and enrich each other. And we see that, I think what's so brilliant about organizing it in this way, I'm not sure whose idea this was, actually, it wasn't mine.
Sure, it was Lucio.
Yeah, I think what's great about it is it shows some of the trade-offs, involved. I mean, and there's no clear-cut single answers, that there's always trade-offs in a democracy. So I have questions, but I think, we have a room full of people who I think probably have questions and thoughts as well. So I would like to open it up, actually. And if we could, I'll start to collect some questions and try to make it. I'm sure lots of people here have opinions too, but let's try to make these questions so that the panelists can then respond. So yes, thank you.
Well, first, wonderful presentations. Thank you. And thanks to the Consul General for the invitation. I'm curious, speaking to the American perception of this, we've heard many, many years of Ambassador Carlucci's role, President Ford's role, and Secretary Kissinger's role. Maybe some description, and we hear many things, truth and fiction, of their perception and their roles in those beginning days as well. Commentary on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what I'd like to do is just get a couple of questions and then give the panelists an opportunity to respond to the questions, also to respond to each other. I think that would be very nice. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful set of presentations. I'm Paul Manuel, a local affiliate. I teach at Georgetown. So I have just a quick question. So we had 48 years of dictatorship, and now we're talking about April 25th, 1974, but we can think about April 25th, 1976, which arguably was more important in the sense that it's been 48 years of democracy. So 48 and 48. And my question is simple. From that time, since 1976, April 25th, we had essentially a bipartisan system, center-left, center-right. And that continued to reaffirm itself in the most recent elections, with the one exception of the emergence of a far-right populist movement, Chega, for the first time in Portuguese history. And my question is, do you assess the rise of Chega as telling us something about the failures of this Republican regime, or is it a recovery of pre-April 25th, 1974 of fascism? Is it connected to failures of the European leadership, or is there something else?
Great. Thank you. Maybe one last question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Thank you for the amazing presentation. Thank you, Professor Ziblatt, for the invitation you made when we last met. I just had one question, is that as has been mainly repercussed outside Portugal, there's been this rise in the populist right in Portugal right now. And how does that right face the legacy of the 25th of April revolution? Is that something they're deniers about? How do they face it? How do they plan to approach this in elections?
Great, thank you. So why don't we begin with Antonio and then kind of work our way through, and also feel free to respond to each other's presentations as well.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for the questions. On Carlucci and the U.S. In 1974, for the first time, as a matter of fact, after the Second World War, we have the communists sharing power with the anti-authoritarian forces. So it was, do not forget that, for instance, in the case of Italy, for instance, the Italian Communist Party, even a big party, as a matter of fact, was in a way illegally, for them, impossible to share power with other parties in Italy. It was a sort of non-written law, to say, of Western Europe during the Cold War. So the first reaction, as a matter of fact, of the U.S. government is, of course, surprise. But Carlucci has a very interesting, I think, strategy. It's very well documented. There are lots of articles about the topic. What Carlucci does is he analyzes the Portugal political scene, and he decides to support the moderate parties and the moderate members of the armed forces. So basically, as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why, in a way, even the parties of the center-right, they dislike a bit the U.S. strategy in those years is because Carlucci bets on Mário Soares. Soares is the leader of the Portuguese Socialist Party. He has an anti-authoritarian legitimacy because he was an anti-fascist, so to say, during the authoritarian regime, but at the same time, he is on the forefront of the anti-leftist political strategy in 1975. So that's basically the strategy, I think, of Carlucci. At the same time, let's not forget that the U.S. also has agreements with the main political families of Europe, mainly the conservatives and Democristians and the social democratic family. And they also have a very important role, for instance, in training, in training of the moderate parties, even in terms of unions, for instance. They are on the base of the creation of a non-communist union, etc., etc., etc. So Carlucci is very important. At the same time, of course, I didn't stress that. At the same time, I have a table on my PowerPoint. In 1975, in the summer 1975, there is, let us say, another type of anti-communist social movement with violence, political violence against, against, for instance, unions, headquarters of left-wing parties, etc. And there are also some political support for that. But basically, thanks to the elections, Carlucci bets on the party wins the election, in this case, the Socialist Party. On Chega, I will answer to the two questions. Chega, as a matter of fact, as many other radical right-wing parties in Europe, they're not a legacy of authoritarianism. They're not a legacy of the past. They're not a legacy of the Salazar regime. As a matter of fact, in the case of Portugal, even the center-right, there is no successor party. In the case of Spain, we have a successor party, let us say, because of the nature of the Spanish transition. In the case of Portugal, no. So Chega has much more to do with contemporary, global, as a matter of fact, with contemporary politics than with the past. There is just one element I would like to stress. Chega. Chega, in terms of the authoritarian past, Chega activates much more a conservative version of Portuguese national identity connected with the glorification of the past, of the expansion, of the discoveries. At the same time, of the colonial past. So Chega activates, yes, in terms of values, Chega activates the legacies of the colonial war, supporting the veterans, a strategy, as a matter of fact, anti-left in terms of deal with the past, slavery, etc., etc. But it does not activate the authoritarian past as a positive value. There are one main reason for that, I think, is that Salazar is associated with backwardness. It's not just a question of conservative values. It's Salazarism is associated with backwardness. Franco is not associated with backwardness in terms of the political culture of the Spanish radical right, but in the case of Portugal, yes. And I think that's probably the main reason why they mainly activate, in political terms, version, let us say, of Portuguese national identity, that it's much more associated with the colonial past. If you touch the symbols, yes. If you touch the symbols, for instance, statues, you know, the cultural wars, typical cultural wars of the beginning of the 21st century, there they are very, 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 very active. And we must admit that the Portuguese political culture is very much, in terms of values as well, for instance, is very much a product of Lusotropicalism. The idea that Portuguese colonialism was a benign experience. Portuguese colonialism was not as British or French colonialism. Yes, that's where they basically stress their politics of the past.
Before you answer, maybe just I can add something into the mix to help. I mean, in the two presentations, in a certain way, I mean, at one level, it seems like there's some tension between the two arguments, right? And so, you know, I recently saw there's this really famous article by Daran Acemoglu and several other co-authors looking at the impact of democratization on economic growth, and so looking, you know, at 130 countries over a 100-year period. And his figure that summarizes it looks very much like Portuguese growth. So in other words, there's this kind of period of rapid economic growth after an episode of democratization, and then a kind of flatlining of it after about 20 years or so. So I'm wondering, is that a more general phenomenon? You know, how do you, is this a uniquely Portuguese story, or is this something more general? So anyway, yeah.
Thanks. Allow me to make 2 points on the initial questions. I actually just wrote a small piece with Christine Carlucci, the daughter of Ambassador Frank Carlucci. She has a book which is coming out talking about the experiences of her
She's
father.
coming to Portugal to launch
Yeah,
the book.
Next 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, 2 weeks
Now,
from
a
now.
point that I would like to try to stress, which comes from being one of the reviewers of the book, actually, and talking to Christine, is the importance of the personal experiences and leverage that Carlucci brought in terms of interactions with the American government. Kissinger was not on board with the support to the left-wing democratic parties in Portugal. Carlucci, due to his own personal experience and context with the administration, was capable of selling the support to the Americans. So this interaction within the American government, beyond the personal interactions that he had with Mário Soares, no Ninho do Corvo, na Casa Carlucci, which is the name of the American ambassador residence in Portugal now, a homage to Carlucci itself. Ninho do Corvo was the topmost room, actually the laundry room of the house, where he would sit down with Mário Soares to talk about strategy, right? So he had this role within the Portuguese political system, but selling the alternatives with the American government itself. On Chega, if I can point out, and then I will actually make a point with yours, fully agree with the notion that they are not a fascist party coming from the part, right? They reflect this sort of a voice of the excluded, which is across European type of phenomenon. I mean, you have the same thing in Italy, you have the same thing in Spain, you have the same thing in France, you have the alternative for Deutschland in Germany, right? These are the, let's put it this way, the left behind of the European social and growth model. They have real grievances in the end of the day, right? So they are the excluded ones, the ones that did not felt represented by our bipolar model distribution of Christian democratic and socialist parties. They needed a voice because they felt that they were not being heard, and they were not being heard, right? So, I mean, in the democracy, what you do is that you constitute a political party, right? That's what I think is the best way for us to try to understand this. Pinpointing and linking this to your own question, you are absolutely right. We are an extreme example of this loss of economic dynamism among Western societies. What I just described to you is actually common to Europe, is common to developed Asia, is common to the United States. Even if the United States has a higher trend growth rate now than Europe has, is actually a third of what they had until the 1970s. So there was some sort of a structural break there, which affected all developed economies with very perverse type of effects in terms of social exclusion, the polarization of our societies. The reasons behind that, they are not clear to understand. We all have those presumably productivity enhancing devices. This little thing that you have there is a miracle, right? So, I mean, this has greater computational power than the ships that we sent to the moon, right? Literally, this is more developed in terms of computational capacity than the computers that they had above the Apollo spaceships. But you look at in terms of the effects of this on average productive level in our economies across the board is nowhere to be found, right? So, I mean, if anything, this has negative effects in terms of productivity.
Right. When I watch my daughter do her homework with her phone on her lap, you can see this. Yeah.
We have long-term rates of IQ for countries around the world. And you know what has happened since the moment that they introduced the iPads? I mean, average global IQ actually has gone down, right? Which is, I mean, so that's not a Portuguese-only phenomenon. There are particular pathologies in Portugal related to our productive structure, I would say, right? The fact that we bet on sectors which, when the Eastern Europeans came into the European Union, our competitive edge just disappeared, right? So all those sectors that produced shoes,
Yeah.
I mean, we're still buying shoes, right? They're being produced somewhere else, right? So what we have is a common, let's put it this way, symptom of this productive and growth malaise, which is across the board on developed economies. We are a particularly strong case of that, but far from being unique. And that's what I think is the ultimate explanation for these possessed revolts in terms of their political representation.
Good. I will add one quick note to the last thing you were saying, because it made me think of a part of your presentation in which you talked about micro companies and the fact that 96% of companies in Portugal are micro. I see that in the north region, of course, that still has a lot of the industry that is left. I was going to complicate that picture by saying that a lot of the entrepreneurs have themselves only a 4th and 6th grade education. And that has proven to be very problematic on a number of fronts, because even in trying to become more competitive as the comparative advantage diminished, right, as salaries started going up, they didn't have the skill set and that they needed to really, exactly. So the ones who survived were better, but like right now in the factories up north, we have a situation in which the factory workers operating the machine sometimes have a college degree, but the owner of the factory and the entrepreneur has a 4th and 6th grade education. I'm not saying this as an elitist thing. I'm talking about this as human capital in the leaders of our companies, and how that has, it has come to this critical juncture in which there's definitely a problem, and we don't necessarily have the skill set to move past it. So very quickly, because a lot has been said already, I too wrote one of those articles on Carlucci and Kissinger, so I know quite a lot about this. I'll just add a couple of things.
The story about the tennis court is completely bullshit.
Really?
Yeah, I know that from then, right?
Ah, interesting. I wasn't going to talk about that.
Okay.
We'll all have to Google this afterwards.
Sorry. That's, I was going to say Carlucci was, in fact, an essential part of the picture. I mean, Kissinger picked him, and he substituted Ambassador Scott, because Ambassador Scott had been a political appointee, and as a situation, after September 28th in particular, and Spínola being pushed out of the Portuguese provisional government, Kissinger was paying attention to what was happening, and he was concerned that this was Russia 1917, and that was the revolution that he was using as a lens to understand the Portuguese Revolution. I think that's pretty well documented as well and well accepted. And one of the quotes that I find very interesting is that less than a year later, in the summer of '75, the reports of him at the State Department, sort of furiously saying, "Whoever sold me this Carlucci as a strong man?" Right? Because Carlucci was not aligning in his reading of the situation in Portugal with the reading that Kissinger had. Kissinger did not particularly like Soares, didn't think that he had what it took to face the communists. He thought that Soares was too soft on the commies and too willing to work with them, too unwilling to push them out of the government. Yeah, the Kerensky of Portugal, exactly. There's that very famous exchange in which, Kissinger tells Soares, "You're a Kerensky." And Soares says, "I don't want to be a Kerensky." And he says, "Neither did Kerensky." Right? So it's the reason why it's so Kissinger as well, right? But at the end of the day, the fact that Carlucci had the background that he did, had the connections that he did, he had way more leverage with the Ford administration than Kissinger himself, I would argue. In part because one of his roommates was the chief of staff of Ford, Donald Rumsfeld. It was his roommate from college. And it was very clear that, when he travels here at the end of the summer in '75 to try to get Kissinger to, see the light and help the moderates and, stop blocking the process, he leverages that. He says, I can just bypass you, go to the president's office. So Carlucci plays a really important role. He is not I don't want to also overemphasize this. There's many other forces and individuals. Helsinki plays the meeting in Helsinki in late summer. The Europeans also play an important role in helping to shape the United States towards a position of support for the moderates. Bringing forward, to believing that that it is still possible to put or maintain the Portuguese Revolution on a democratic course. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories there. But I think, again, Carlucci did play a very important role. So I just want to say a couple of words on Chega, which is they are, though they are not the only party that is doing this in Portugal, they're instrumentalizing the memory of the revolution by talking quite a lot about the 25 de Novembro, the 25th of November, right? The revolution goes through various stages. The final stage, so to say, is often referred to as a coup. As Antonio pointed out, right, there's a struggle within the armed forces movement itself, right? The moderates basically take over the process from that point on. And there's been a politicization of the 25 de Novembro. Just this week I was reading about Nuno Melo, I believe, right? The head of the CDS wants a commission for the celebration of the 25th of November. This, by the left, is a slap in the face of the memory of the 50 years of the revolution. But it's something that the new parties on the right in particular, Chega and Iniciativa Liberal, are trying to reframe as the true revolutionary moment, the true path that took us away from fascism and communism towards democracy, and want to see it celebrated side by side with today, right, as being of equal value. And I was struck by that Ramalho Yanes interview, coming out and disagreeing with it. But anyway, there is some playing and instrumentalization and some questioning of the narratives of the revolution, right? What that revolution meant, what it brought to us. That's definitely present. It's being used by social movements on the right and on the left. It's, I'm not sure where the conversation is going with Chega, but yeah, go ahead.
I have to personally say that I find it difficult to see a scenario in which you cannot talk politically about the 25 de November. So,
Right.
I mean, by the very logic of the movement.
May I just add one thing, very, very briefly, on the politics of the past of Portuguese,
Yeah.
Portuguese democracy? We did a study, as a matter of fact, it was published last week. I was already in Brazil. My institute with the official commissions for the celebration of the 25th of April. And as far as we can see, the attitudes of the Portuguese towards the past did not change much. For instance, the Portuguese are still very much proud on the April 25th revolution. It's okay. Now, what is interesting, I think, when we discuss the politics of the past, we must be very careful with how, let us say, democratic or non-democratic political forces do frame different events of the past. The 25 November is one very interesting example. Why? 2 seconds. First, because the socialist and the moderate, the military of the center-left were the winners of the 25 November against the radicals of the left. Now, what happens in the last 45 years is that progressive, or, you know, the right, the conservative right is trying to open this cleavage, 25th of April versus 25 November, 25th of. But that's an invention of the politics of the past of a democratic regime. It has nothing to do with the, you know, with the events of the 25th of April. But it's very interesting because the socialists decided to celebrate just the 25th of April. And that's how, let us say, now the radical right, of course, is using the 25th of November, the anti-communist struggle in a way to legitimize this sort of. So it's this kind of battles over memory are much more important than the authoritarian past. And even Chega legitimized itself in the 25 November, not exactly on the Salazar regime.
So we actually had more questions, but I think we are now out of time, I'm sorry to say. So I'm glad this has stimulated so much great debate. I mean, to conclude, I think I would say, you know, this memory politics is actually kind of a part of normal democratic politics, and this is what all democracies do. And so, in that sense, is a sign of a vibrant democracy potentially. I mean, I understand that it can feel dangerous, but this is, you know, all democracies experience this. One other point, and I guess this sort of comes from a perspective of an American. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like Portuguese don't need to be reminded of the role of Carlucci. But I think Americans need to be reminded of the role of Carlucci and the importance of, and you know, this is an appropriate note to maybe end on at the Center for European Studies, you know, of the transatlantic relationship, of the role of having good political leaders in the United States and the responsibilities they have, and knowledgeable people who are knowledgeable about what's happening in Europe, and the importance of that, given, you know, what's happening in Ukraine and so on today. So I think this is another great lesson that we can learn from this. So thank you, everybody, and please join me in thanking the panel.